I think let's get started. We may still have a few people trickling in, but that's all right. So let's kick off as always by acknowledging country. So I'm joining today from Wurundjeri Wurrung country, as I generally am. I live and work in Melbourne now, and I pay my respect to the Wurundjeri and thank the elders of not just the Wurundjeri, but all of the First Nations around this country for looking after the country for countless generations. And we share that aim of looking after the country and also restoring a safe climate for all generations of all species. And we extend the same respect to traditional owners of the land that you are all joining from, including any elders who are here with us today. And if you've not come across Climate Emergency Australia before, we're a network of Australian councils that are responding to the climate emergency. And I'll tell you a little bit later how else you can connect with us. And I'll tell you about some exciting things that we've got going on. But for now, let's get started on our introductions. So as I mentioned, this is a collaboration with CASB, which is the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment. And this is the second webinar in our climate risk series, and you can still catch up on the first recording, which I'll include in my email out to you after this. But this particular webinar is zooming in on land use planning, which is why we've collaborated with CASB on this one. My co-host today is Natasha Palic, who is Executive Officer of CASB, and I'll hand over to her to just let us know a little bit about what CASB is all about. And let's make sure you're able to unmute. Yes, you are.
Thank you, Sally, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to talk in more depth about planning and climate risk. So CASB is a Victorian alliance of councils working in sustainable built environments, and our member councils have been collaborating for over 20 years. So it's a long time. We formed formally in 2009, but we were working together before then. And CASB looks after the Built Environment Sustainability Scorecard. That's the best tool. And we have programs for sustainable buildings and sustainable subdivisions. We have 44 councils in Victoria of 79 are our members, and that represents over 80% of the Victorian population. And I believe that I'm joined here today by my CASB colleagues, Shannon Best, Nicole Wood and Bridie Guy. And you can find out more about CASB by visiting our website, and there's a contact email, and we'd love to hear from you regardless of where you are in this beautiful country. And thank you very much, Sally, for organising this on behalf of us both. It's great to be involved. We look forward to hearing from the speakers.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natasha. And feel free to drop a link to CASB in the chat if you'd like to, so people can find that. So yeah, today we're talking about land use planning from a climate risk perspective. As Natasha has outlined in our chats, it's a really good idea to kind of think about the multiple roles of councils in land use planning. So we can think about it particularly from two perspectives. One in the sense of what should be built where, in line with the overall vision for the area, so land use planning in that sense, and then also the council role in actually influencing the built form and the sustainability of new developments, so more like the details of what sort of new developments get approved rather than what goes where. And we will be touching on both of these aspects today, but we'll probably focus a little more on the former, particularly considering where it is safe for people to live in the context of our climate change, of our changing climate, and that's including slow changes like sea level rise, for example, but also acute events like recurring floods and fires, cyclones, and other extreme weather. But before we get into all of that, I'm going to start introducing our speakers today. So we've got Charlotte Turner, who's a lawyer and a climate risk expert. And she was one of the speakers in our March webinar. So again, go back and check that out if you want to get a general briefing on climate risk first. And today she's going to help us contextualise climate risk in planning from a legislative point of view. And then we'll also have Jane Keddie, who's the Director of Hanson Partnership, and she's also the Vice President of the Planning Institute of Australia, Victoria, and she's going to outline the planning reform occurring around the country with a focus on Victoria. And she's going to discuss whether recent reform is supporting a move towards more climate resilient built environment or otherwise. And then we'll have finally Narelle Poole, who was the project coordinator for the relocation of the town of Grantham in the Lockyer Valley in Queensland. She was also one of the founding members of the Community of Practice on Relocation, Retreat and Resilience in Australia. That's called COPRA. And she will share some of her experiences in helping councils and communities plan for relocation and her perspectives on barriers, enablers and outcomes. So before we actually get started with our speakers, I just want to let you know that we're going to have a couple of breaks to ask questions. So we'll have our first two speakers, Charlotte and Jane, then we'll have a little break for questions. And then we'll have another break for questions after Narelle before we get into a big panel discussion at the end. So there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion. And so feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go. That will make it easy for us to collect those up. But also when we do actually get to those Q&A sections, if you just want to raise your hand and have a chat, that's also great. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Charlotte. As I mentioned, she's a lawyer who specialises in climate risk, including legal and financial liability. She's also a research fellow in the Laureate Program on Global Corporate Climate Accountability, and she's had a long-standing role in the Chancery Lane project as well. So Charlotte, over to you. And Charlotte, you have 10 minutes.
Thanks, Sally. I'm unmuted, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, as Sally mentioned, I am a climate risk governance lawyer. So my expertise is in the governance of risk. But as mentioned, we're going to talk about that today in the context of planning. And if you would like further, more detailed information about climate risk, go back and watch the first session, because I did a longer session of that in March. And I am particularly worried about the climate and nature crisis, because I have 4-year-old twins who I am hoping that they will their future will be on a safe and livable planet, and they'll still be able to go and see the Great Barrier Reef and enjoy koalas and things like that. Okay, so we'll get going with my 10 minutes. And so just really quickly going to frame our conversation about risk and think about it in the different contexts. And firstly, starting off with the physical risks and what do risks actually mean? It's the kind of the intersection of the climate hazard, which would be the extreme weather event or the chronic impact that Sally briefly mentioned. It's the intersectionality of those hazards with the who or what might be exposed to that risk and their level of vulnerability. And in the National Climate Risk Assessment that was published last year in September 2025, the Australian government adapted their sort of risk model to include response. So just moving on to the next slide. So that's how we kind of think about the physical risks and impacts. But the way that can I move the slide, Sally?
No, Charlotte, just let me know whenever you want to.
Okay, yeah, we'll move to the next one. Thank you. But when I'm talking about risk and legal risk, often the question that I get asked in this context is what is the legal risk in relation to climate change? And that's not quite the right question, because when thinking about risk management, and it's not just the law, sort of the risk landscape and what falls into that bucket of what is reasonably foreseeable, which kind of triggers different obligations, whether they're in statutes or laws or whatever. It's that reasonable foreseeability. And so I sort of have hard law down at the bottom of my funnel, because that's the kind of baseline, and then all of the things that go up on top of that. So soft law and regulatory guidance, increased understanding and knowledge of the science, which then plays into what communities expect and activists and stakeholder expectations. So from that risk and legal risk perspective, it isn't just laws, it's what is reasonably foreseeable in relation to whatever it might be in terms of decision making and those sorts of things. And if we can just move on to the next one, Sally, and for me, and in the context of financial risks and legal risks that can be presented by climate change, they're sort of broken up into three categories or two main categories, and then the legal and liability risks flowing out of those. So the physical risks are things that we talked about briefly at the beginning, and it's the consideration of how the physical impacts of climate change, whether it be extreme weather events or the chronic impacts, what financial risks did those pose to councils' assets and built environment, and also the continuation of operations and offering of services for the communities. The economic transition risk are the risks that arise from the economies transforming or moving towards a low carbon future, and those sort of policy and regulation that might be brought into place to manage that transition, technological advances, and also stakeholder preferences, and those stakeholders that sit at the top end, whether they are financiers, banks, insurers, or those types of stakeholders, but then right down through to your community members and their expectations. And then and these can present risks if these aren't sort of properly managed or thought about in terms of access to capital, costs of funding, the availability of adequate insurance, and then this concept of stranded assets, that an asset might materially devalue prior to the end of its planned useful life, or things like that. And then the liability risks can arise out of a mismanagement of either the physical risks or economic transition risks, the failure to mitigate and adapt or disclose those risks, and the mismanagement or inadequate management of them. And we'll just move on to the next one, please, Sally, just quickly. And I've just put some heads of cases, heads of claim up when thinking about litigation risk, because there isn't a head of claim for climate change. There's not, and it falls into pretty much any type of existing head of claim. But obviously for council, one of the main ones that comes up and is thought about, and in for the context of today, is planning, mapping and development approvals, consideration of overlay maps, and whether they need to be updated, because one of the recurring themes in either cases that have happened or advice on the proper management of climate risk is that because of the changes, even though we don't know exactly what they're going to be or what level temperatures will be held at, what we do know for sure is that history is not a valid analog for the future. And so where there needs to be updates to things because they might be based on outdated information is a key area of potential risk, and where decisions are being made on overlays or whatever that might then be challenged because they've not been updated. That presents quite a significant area of risk, and where there's lots of litigation or cases that are brought against councils, or whether the challenge of planning approvals or not approvals on those sorts of bases. And also the other one I just wanted to mention up there just quickly was negligence and nuisance, but then also contractual disputes, and the consideration of how robust force majeure clauses might be, especially in long-term asset contracts. That now what we know, force majeure is a sort of legal concept about an act of God, and those things not being reasonably foreseeable. But now with how much we do know about projected climate impacts, then how does that actually fit with reasonable foreseeability and force majeure? And so consideration about whether those clauses in contracts are still fit for purpose. I will just move on quickly, Sally. Thank you. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, my area of expertise is in governance. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about planning, certainly, because it's not my area of expertise. And we have Jane, who's going to talk to you next about that. But I've just put up some examples of where climate change can come through in local government acts. I'm working in Victoria, and so I've got our local government act up here, and there's sort of overarching principles that specifically call out climate change risk. And so even thinking back to my funnel before and saying that, like hard law or whatever is just the bottom, where there is climate change specifically called out in whether it be local government acts or planning legislation, and even where it doesn't, in the consideration of good decision making and duties of care, how to think about planning and decisions around what will be approved or what won't. Next one, please, Sally. Oh, I can't see the next. Okay, I can't see the next slide, but I think we've moved on to it. So I will talk to it. So that this slide again just makes the point about decision makings having regard to climate change principles, and that's in the Climate Change Act here in Victoria. And I had a look before as I was preparing for this, that there are sort of various obligations contained in different planning laws, whether there's an express requirement to take into account climate change impacts. For example, there's in Victoria one of the planning things, but again, outside of the legislation, when decisions are being made, there are principles about governance and like sort of good and robust decision making, that if and when a challenge should arise to a decision, there is that sort of robust process that's sat behind decision making that has taken into account reasonably foreseeable information, and there's sort of specific contexts where duties do arise, and but generally speaking, good decision making and good governance takes into account reasonably foreseeable information, and especially important where, say, for example, council documents have been, like strategic plans or business plans and asset plans have been updated to include climate issues, that also then brings into that lens of what was reasonably foreseeable. And I think, like, I've got some other slides in here. Sally, we can just move on briefly. Sort of kind of talked a little bit about negligence, and I think that I know that we're going to have a question and answer session afterwards, and the slides that I have next, there's just one about where there was an example of some examples of where there's been litigation, but given the focus is on planning, I think I'll stop so we can hear from Jane, and then in the question and answer I can sort of apply any of the legal stuff to the planning.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm sure people will have questions, so just hold on, folks, and do put them in the chat if you'd like to. We will have a 5-minute break for questions after we hear from Jane. But let's hear from Jane. So as I said, she's the Director of Hanson Partnership, Vice President of the Planning Institute of Australia, Victoria. And over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks for having me, everyone. I've been working really at the intersection of climate change and planning for probably around 15 years now. And certainly things are getting a lot more tangible, but things are also changing quite rapidly at the moment. So it's good to be able to, to check in. Next slide, please. As Charlotte's already pointed out, importantly at federal level, we now have the National Climate Risk Assessment, which really provides us with a kind of crucial evidence base on climate risk across Australia, and includes the scenarios of 1.5, 2 and 3 degrees. And it really evaluated some of the severity of impacts under kind of current and future timeframes. And we've got a complementary national adaptation plan, which was also released, and that looked at the priority risks kind of based on sectorial and a few kind of cross-sectorial areas. From a planning perspective, one of the challenges, however, is that this kind of sectorial-based approach in adaptation action can mask the really crucial role that land use planning decisions play kind of across all of those sectors. Next slide, please. As Charlotte's articulated, responding to climate change is increasingly embedded in those legislative obligations that councils face, and planning is really one of the most effective and the most cost-effective tools that we have available to manage that climate risk. It's also really important as it's really the key lever that councils have to shape outcomes on private land, which for most councils is really the vast majority of their municipalities. But while land use planning is really critical, often the devil is really in the detail, and sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between our broader legislative settings and our policy ambitions and the practices on the ground. Next slide, please. So in Victoria, we've really had some very significant steps in recognising the crucial role that the planning system plays. And so among those, we've got a new purpose within our planning scheme. So for those outside of Victoria, that's your kind of essentially your state policy, your local policy, as well as your kind of development controls. And we have a new purpose, which is really to support responses to climate change. We've got a new objective for the preparation of those kind of planning frameworks, which really speaks to an explicit consideration of the policies and obligations regarding climate change built into our Planning and Environment Act here in Victoria. And we've also got another objective which will come in probably in the latter half of this year that relates to the planning system as a whole, and really is to ensure that the use and development of land is planned and designed to respond and adapt to climate change. Really importantly as well, alongside that, when that new objective for the planning framework came in, we've also got a new requirement for a climate change considerations report and an associated ministerial direction that kicks in basically any time someone wants to make a change to a planning scheme. Next slide, please. However, There is a nationwide housing agenda, and it is really having some significant impacts on councils' ability to respond to these kind of higher order and longer term objectives. So the housing strategy, the housing agenda really, I think, has been largely focused around a kind of a narrative of supply and approval numbers, rather than, I guess, a conversation around the qualitative or kind of spatial considerations that we might be talking about today. And planning's really been framed a little bit as a kind of a blocker within that kind of broader deregulation agenda. In the Victorian context, the reform to the planning system has really been, I think, generationally significant. And it's been almost entirely driven by the housing statement that was released by the state government in 2024. So that's important because the origin of the reforms to kind of everything from legislation to particular provisions, which are the kind of Victorian controls, within the kind of that document, which had a singular focus on housing, has really created a number of areas of conflict with adaptation planning in Victoria. And I imagine there's probably similar issues playing out in other states, albeit perhaps not quite as significantly as here in Victoria. Next slide, please. There's a few challenges, and I'm going to touch on some of these challenges. I think Sally talked earlier about the whether we were moving in the right direction or not. I think that there is certainly some challenges that have come up through some of the reform that's occurred in the last few years. One of the challenges that we're seeing is really in a move towards the use of codes, and I know that that's obviously something that occurs in other areas as well. But essentially, this means we've got individual elements of development that are really being looked at in isolation, rather than the cumulative impact and the context being part of a planning consideration. And so there's a tendency, when housing is in such high demand, to kind of discount strategic policy that might mitigate some of those increases in density in favour of lot scale design responses. So we can deal with that issue at a lot scale. But from a kind of big picture planning perspective, that's not always going to be the right answer when we have these impacts increasing over time, and we do risk locking people into some of those poor long-term situations on a kind of presumption that there'll be protection, even when that protection isn't necessarily designed or funded. So we also have some challenges really around some loopholes, if you like, and I talked about the really positive steps that we've seen in the climate agenda, and one of them being the climate change considerations reporting that we now have in place here in Victoria, which is fantastic. But there are loopholes, and I'm sure this is the case in lots of other states as well. So in Victoria, for example, the activity centres, which are the kind of transit-orientated development program, which is a really positive thing in terms of getting more people living where they can access sustainable transport, that doesn't trigger under the ministerial direction a climate change considerations report. So we have a context now where we have, and you can see up on screen, statements around the activity centre areas that say that building is fine in anywhere other than kind of high risk areas, and that's obviously contrary to both existing state policy but also the federal guidelines that we can see up on screen. There's also some gaps, and this is an important one from a planning perspective, and certainly there's been some recent decisions through the appeals tribunal here in Victoria, but where we don't have a specific permit trigger, then there can be some real challenges in terms of how councils can actually consider those climate risks and the hazards as well. We have politics, of course, always plays into things, and that's not necessarily just politics at state level, but it's really at all levels, and it's certainly, and I saw something in the chat before, it's certainly an issue for local governments as well, and it's a particular I think it's a particular challenge for local governments where they're representing their existing communities, and those existing communities might have particular views on things, and how those views are balanced with those kind of longer term obligations that councils face is really challenging, particularly when things like property values are potentially impacted. Money is always a key challenge. Who's funding what? Who's paying for that adaptation? It remains fairly unresolved from a planning perspective, and often kind of gets pushed to the side because it really hasn't been dealt with. But perhaps when we think about planning, perhaps one of the biggest challenges that local governments have in this space is really that both the direct impacts of climate change in terms of climate events, but also the steps that we really know we need to take to respond to those, which in some areas will inevitably include managed transition or retreat. It has really very real and significant impacts on our communities, and I'm sure Narelle will talk to some of those impacts in the next session. Next slide, please, Sally. So if we think about those bigger picture challenges in a Victorian context, getting to maybe some of the specifics, we've had new codes introduced here in Victoria, and there's some real challenges with some of the presumptions underlying those codes. The framing of the controls essentially switches off for a lot of development all other planning considerations. So the code is the only thing that applies, which is not necessarily in and of itself a problematic approach. It's just some of the presumptions that it's based on create real challenges from a climate perspective, and one of those challenges is that it's based on a presumption that all of our existing zoned land is okay to develop. Whereas we actually know in Victoria we have quite a lot of legacy zoning, so land that's zoned for residential purposes, but perhaps if we were looking at it today, it wouldn't pass the tests we would need it to pass in terms of its suitability for residential development. The other one is it's presumed that those overlays are in place to really allow for consideration of climate hazards, and that trigger exists, and this is just fundamentally not the case. There are really significant gaps in the overlays that we have in place that reflect where we experience climate hazards. We've got gaps as well in terms of the available tools. Coastal erosion's one that springs to mind. We don't really have the right tools available for councils, and we do still have some outdated benchmarks. So many decisions are still made on the basis of a 0.8 metre sea level rise, but we have some state processes considering 1.1 metres. We have a marine and coastal strategy that says that the benchmark should be reviewed and updated in I think it was about 2022, which still hasn't happened. And then we have obviously most recently some federal guidance which uses 0.94 as a planning benchmark. So there's some inconsistencies there which make it really challenging for planners in understanding the benchmarks and the models. So sometimes that data can be really hard to find, and it's not always up to date. So really there's a very critical lens that planners need to bring to these kinds of decisions that we make, and sometimes that includes looking beyond what's kind of technically required because there happens to be an overlay to that broader context, similar to what Charlotte was referring to earlier, what those broader obligations to think about are beyond the planning system. Next slide, please.
And Jane, that's your nearly 2-minute warning.
Got that. So most crucially, I guess as a state, we haven't really started to talk seriously about which parts of our state are really suitable for settlement under climate change. Climate change hazards were, I think, almost entirely absent from our recent plan for Victoria, and those cumulative impacts are still poorly understood. So adaptation's really happening in a kind of a reasonably ad hoc manner, so kind of project by project, place by place, and we don't have a kind of consistency across the state in that space from a planning perspective, which is really challenging because we know that adaptation planning really needs to start before disasters. So particularly in understanding kind of which areas are more suitable for long-term growth. And some of the difficult conversations that we need to have with our communities, which interstate experience tells us can be deeply problematic in kind of recovery periods, aren't yet on the table. And indeed, you know, some of our post disaster responses really still are focused on kind of fast tracking and facilitating rebuilds, although we did have a recent parliamentary inquiry that had something to say on that matter. So just to round things off, last slide please, Sally, so that it's not all negative. We do genuinely have a lot of opportunities through the planning system. So there really are numerous opportunities to reset things and to continue to take steps forward to really better leverage that power of land use planning. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jane, for that insightful look across the planning reform landscape. So we've now got 5 minutes for questions just for Charlotte and Jane, and I'm going to unshare so that people can see each other's faces. And Natasha, I'm going to hand over to you to moderate. I see that you've been collecting questions in the chat, so I'll keep an eye on the chat from now on. And I did see somebody had their hand up. I think it was Diane. But over to you, Natasha, and let me spotlight Charlotte again.
Sure thing. So there was a question in the chat when you were talking, Charlotte, about the Local Government Act and the discharge of statutory obligations. You know, how does this sit with councils that have councillors that block action on climate change?
Well, I think in relation to the Local Government Act, in those principles, it specifically calls out mitigation and planning for climate risks, and I mean the language is around to be promoted, but where there's pushback against making decisions, you know, because of climate change or for whatever other reason. So there's a couple of levers. There's that wording in the climate change, in the Local Government Act, that it is within the core duties to consider climate change risk. So without doing so, that's a non-fulfillment of your duties. But then also the sort of like financial risk levers of if bringing those financial risks that I talked briefly to, if bringing that lens of personal view on not believing in climate change or being a skeptic or whatever, that also then feeds into financial risk issues. And when thinking about the sort of the planning, the things that Jane was talking to, there's a whole without like sort of bringing forward that personal view is not acting in the best interest of the council or of councillors. And so I think there's legal risk in not discharging duties, but then also sort of not thinking about these things from a financial risk lens for what that might mean for council's assets and operations could be an issue.
Thanks, Charlotte. There are a couple of questions about whether or not there's a perspective on other states. Perhaps when we go through some of these other questions, if you've got an insight, perhaps if you could share it as well. This was a question from a Victorian, and it talked about the Climate Change Act, the role of that in applying, the role of that in local government decision makers. Can you got a comment on that, Charlotte?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think just in the context of the municipal health and wellbeing plan that needs to be developed by councils in the Climate Change Act, and then the sort of principles that apply to decision making around those things, and then how in the development of that municipal health and wellbeing plan, sort of like the intersection of other council plans or strategies, making sure that there's sort of like one, there's not things in the municipal health and wellbeing plan that might be contrary to other council documents.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's one about the duty of care. And where does the duty of care lie to consider future climate projections based on the various global emissions scenarios and their impacts on existing land use?
I think that the kind of duty around like good governance and duty of care, that using sort of global scenarios kind of like feeds into part of the decision making, and so the duty is to sort of make those decisions in relation to your specific context. And so sorry, I think I missed a little bit of is the question about whether you should use the global scenarios?
Yeah, does it apply retrospectively? Like when you're looking at a land that's been zoned something for many years and perhaps has become at risk because of climate change, you know, what duty does council have? Is it that as soon as they become aware of the risk, they then have a duty of care? Or I guess we're thinking about existing subdivisions, for example.
Sorry, Jane, did you want to? No. So it wouldn't be that like a global climate scenario then suddenly triggers a duty of care for council to suddenly consider. It's about how, in like the sum of all of the parts of the information that's available at the time the decision is made, what like council knew, what they ought to have known, and when that decision was met. Pardon?
I did.
No, you're right. You're right.
Okay. And sort of that holistic, or the sort of what was reasonable to take into account. And I think one of the important points there as well is that it's looked at in the context of the council's decision making. Yes, what they should have known or reasonably ought to have known, but then also in the would it actually be reasonable to expect a council to take into account a global scenario and apply it to their decision making? Sort of there would be the consideration of the feasibility of the of those sorts of things as well. So it's all very contextual, and it's not just okay, there's been a release of this thing, this triggers an automatic duty.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Natasha, we're out of time for this little mini Q&A, but don't worry, folks, we will have more Q&A time a little bit later on. Thank you, Natasha, for moderating that one. Let's now hand over to Narelle, and let me share the slides again so that we can see Narelle's presentation. Bear with us while that loads. All right, so Narelle, as I mentioned, was the project coordinator for the relocation of the town of Grantham, a founding member of the Community of Practice on Relocation, Retreat and Resilience in Australia, and she's currently a consultant with Water Technology. Over to you, Narelle. Oh, Narelle, can you unmute yourself?
Of course, there. How's
there
that?
We go.
Is that better? Okay, on to the next slide.
Oh, sorry, we've lost the slides. Or have we? Are you all able to see slides? Oh, sorry, I think I need to oh, you can see it, but I can't. Sorry, go on, Narelle, and meanwhile, I'm just going to reshare.
Okay, I can see the first slide. Anyway, I'll continue on. So today I'll speak with you about my involvement in the work at Grantham in southeast Queensland and a little on the Northern Rivers in New South Wales as well. And that was focusing on Lismore. So I'll share some of my experiences. So like a couple of case studies with councils and communities experiencing relocation and what barriers, enablers and outcomes are possible. So the context for Grantham, just back one for a moment. It's a rich agricultural area. There were 37,000 residents in the Lockyer Valley at the time of the floods. The floods were December 2010 and culminating in January 2011 on the 10th of January. So the floods peaked into what was referred to as an inland tsunami. Next slide. 19 lives were lost. 2,290 properties were inundated in the Lockyer Valley, with Grantham being the epicentre. So I've got these photos here just to provide a reality check of what happened. Now, I want to say that the Mayor, Steve Jones, was in the thick of it, driving heavy machinery, assisting with evacuations at the peak of the flood. So the Mayor really had skin in the game, as I would say. In this project, it was always about the people. The overwhelming floods and destruction needed an innovative solution. And even while supporting the community heartache that followed the flooding and all of those deaths, the Mayor and the CEO had a plan in 1 week. The momentum was there for a permanent solution to regular flooding, not just a patch-up job. And the solution was a voluntary land swap. With fewer than 500 residents in the Grantham area, a land swap plan was hatched. So a flood-free block of land in exchange for the flooded block of land on a like-for-like basis. So people could rebuild safely. There was no cost to the residents for the land. It was a swap. So keeping the community together was logical, made sense for the residents. So those who were insured, they could spend their insurance money to rebuild on higher ground rather than rebuild back in the floodplain, just to be flooded again. For residents who weren't insured, they were able to gain access to other government and charity funding to make the move. So they could still swap their land. They just had funding from places other than insurance. But the key move for council was to purchase suitable land out of the flooded area. So next slide, please. Thank you. Importantly, once again, I'll mention, it was all about the community. From the day of the flood, the Mayor and councillors regularly met with community. Pivotal community engagement workshops were held 2 months after the floods, where we explored possibilities. And these are the photos from those workshops. So the community was valued and mostly felt a true sense of ownership over the project. Of course, there were cynics as well, but mostly people were involved and on board. Next slide. So within 2 months of the flood, council secured a suitable property of 935 acres on which to construct a master planned community. At that time, the Queensland Reconstruction Authority was born, and its powers were used to streamline the planning processes. Now, I'm not a planner, but I understand the value of what planners bring and the planning system. So the land was just a cow paddock. It wasn't in the urban footprint. So we needed those emergency powers that the QRA were given to quickly get the land into the urban footprint and approve the subdivision. Without this action, the solution was only a pipe dream. And thankfully, the QRA used their powers. Now, the council had bought the land, so they had no money left. They were in debt. So we put our hand out for a meagre 18 million in funding. Stage 1 would be 80 blocks of land. Stage 2 would bring another 40 for a total of 120. And in the end, all 120 blocks were taken up. Next slide, please. So we often, after the project, stepped back and looked at the simplicity of it, and it was broken down into 3 areas. So planning and approvals is the essential work to keep the momentum going. I don't need to tell you that. So into this category for this project, we also bundle the legal work around the property purchases and sales, all the policies. They needed to be simple, fair, and equitable, and all that went on in the background to ensure the project progressed. So obstacles were overcome without drama. Construction is obvious. The machinery employed for road building, drainage works, and everything needed to build a new estate. And the third is community. They were crucial to consult and bring along in the ownership of this project. We had to be building what the community needed. All 3 areas needed to work together, and without any one of these, the project would have been severely impacted or not taken off at all. Each one was as important as the other. Next slide, please. Gradually, trust was built with most of the cynics, and eventually there could be no dispute as they witnessed the building of the new estate. This spoke a whole lot louder than words. There was a mountain of work being done in the background, of course, but the evidence was the works being carried out in the new estate. The Lockyer Valley Regional Council was able to use their crews to do this work, and this provided a close link to the community, with workers proudly bringing their families to the site on weekends to show the progress. So once again, community-centred. Next slide, please. And in only 11 months from the disaster itself, we had the first family move into the first new house, completed on the new estate, from cow paddock to fully serviced estate. In the next slide, we'll see the timeline. It's quite amazing. We haven't got time to go into it, but just to see that what can be done in 11 months from disaster to the first new house. So I'm going to move on now to the Northern Rivers area. So you can see the white shaded map there. So the Northern Rivers area of Northern New South Wales is 7 local government areas from the Queensland border to Grafton, with a total population of over 300,000. So this area, and especially Lismore, historically floods. Next slide, please. However, in the flood of February 2022, it exceeded all previous floods by 1.5 metres. Now that's a lot of water in anyone's language. And that was in Lismore. And some areas were flooded, many areas were flooded for the first time. 1 month later, another flood hit the area. And while not as large as the first, it affected many who had already started the cleanup from the first flood. So the community was absolutely traumatised. Next slide, please. After minimal community engagement, New South Wales State Government decided on a buyback program for all of the Northern Rivers areas. Essentially, the Resilient Homes program started in October 2022, 8 months after the flood, with an initial budget of $700 million, which increased to $790 million. After the launch of the Resilient Homes program, the community members raised awareness of the issue that actually there's no local land to relocate their homes to or to build anew. And a lot of the homes down there were relocatable because they were old timber homes. It was fine to get a buyback, but if they wanted to stay in the community, where would they be able to afford to buy? So then the Resilient Lands Strategy was launched by the government to identify possible available land, and the Resilient Lands program commenced in March 2023 with a budget of $100 million to procure and develop land for buyback participants to purchase and to relocate to. Next slide, please. So when the budget was announced, there was a total of 6,000 homes identified as being part of the program, with 2,000 homes eligible for buyback and 4,000 homes eligible for raising or retrofitting. However, another change, and by June 2023, some 8 months later, the numbers had been drastically decreased by the state government to 1,100 for buyback and 370 for raising and retrofitting. So the community was re-traumatised. Next slide. So, quick overview of my role. It was to interact face-to-face with the community and provide a consistent approach with practical information amongst the frustration of perceived government indecision and inaction. Next slide. So we had a number of buyback recipients who found their own land to relocate their homes. And in recent times, 4 years after the flood, other buyback houses now owned by state government have been sold to be relocated by their new owners. So not people who experienced the flood, but anybody can buy these homes now. So no land has yet become available. Unfortunately, no land has yet become available through the Resilient Lands program for those who've been impacted by the flood. So next slide, please. So some takeaways for you. The best outcomes are when community is front and centre and the project is locally led. Land availability can be the making or the breaking of a project. This is why much advocacy is happening with governments around adaptation action plans, such as what Jane was talking about, to have land earmarked for future relocation projects. And COPRA, the Community of Practice on Relocation, Retreat and Resilience in Australia, is very active in this space. Having skin in the game provides great incentive for decisive leadership and to keep the momentum going. If big decisions such as land purchase are not made promptly, projects can fail and communities are dispersed. It's hard to reclaim relationships down the track if they haven't been built from the beginning. Devastated community members appreciate the continuity of staff in projects and can be easily thrown into overwhelm when staff keep changing and they lose the trust they have built. So I'll leave it there, and I understand we'll go into questions.
Thank you so much, Narelle. That was fantastic. We are going to have about 3 to 5 minutes now for another little mini Q&A just for Narelle, and I'll hand over again to Natasha to moderate this one. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thanks, Narelle. Really demonstrates some of the comments at the end really linked to planning and having a land use strategy in place, which is where this first question comes from. So in Grantham, how is the swapped flood impacted land used now?
That's a great question. Actually, we were up there about 12 months ago and there was a beautiful gymkhana being held, and there's one big area where everybody had accepted the land swap. And so council has made available at I think it's what they call a peppercorn lease rate, you know, maybe $1 a year for 99 years, for community groups to use facilities, not to build permanent structures on them, but, you know, a gymkhana, it's perfect. The horses are there. The people come from all over Australia, actually. Gymkhanas apparently are very busy in growing these days. So that's one of the issues. One of the uses. Other uses, farmers have, with properties adjoining some of these areas, have been granted use of the land, but they're certainly taken out of the residential use area.
Okay, thank you. And there's a follow-up question about that new subdivision in Grantham. Was it designed as a town? So was there a main street for shops or was the existing main street retained?
So because of our limited funds, it was only a residential area. We've got so much more land left up there because we had 935 acres. So there's possible future subdivision, future town area, future commercial areas. But for the land swap itself, it was very clear it was only for residential. So we had to draw the line, and one of the things about keeping it simple.
Mm-hmm. And is it far away, Narelle, from the original land?
No,
The original time, sorry.
1 kilometre maybe.
Mm-hmm.
The school is between the two areas, primary school.
Sure.
So 1 kilometre, one and a half maybe, if I was walking uphill there.
Great, thank you. Sally, do we have any more time, or are we?
I think we could have time for one more question for Narelle.
Okay, the next one is how the government had 535 acres available. Was this land repurposed from a different use?
No, it wasn't available. The council bought it. So it was on the market for sale, and the council said yes. And this is what I say about decisive leadership. They could have messed around for 12 months and lost it. And it was in the perfect place. The mayor knew the area very well. And yes, so it was like, snap, we're going to buy this. It's out of the flood. It's not in a bushfire area. It's not in a landslip area. We're going to grab it.
Yeah, okay. There's other questions, but maybe we can bring them out in the panel discussion.
For sure. Yeah, let's get into the panel discussion. So we'll bring back Jane and Charlotte. And so now we're going to go into a little bit of a panel discussion with all of our speakers, including Natasha. So I'm going to moderate this one. And I'm actually going to ask Natasha the first question. And we've got a few sort of overarching questions to talk about, but then we'll hand back over to you. And I know that we've got lots of questions that haven't been answered yet in the chat, so we've got plenty to choose from. But my question to you, Natasha, is just simply, I know you've been collecting a lot of the themes and takeaways. What were some of the kind of main themes and takeaways, I guess, that stood out to you from hearing from our three speakers so far?
Look, from Charlotte, it was this reasonable foreseeability intersection with force majeure. And so this idea that there's a collective understanding of what we can reasonably anticipate in terms of climate impacts. And that's going to, there's more and more events will fall down on that side of the, this is what I got from your conversation, there's more and more events that will fall down on that side of the argument than on the, it's God's will type thing. And that this then does potentially put the decision making in the spotlight. So that's what I one of the key points that I got from you. And it was, I mean, this is what CASB does, and so it shouldn't be a surprise, but just hearing it said, council's key lever to shape outcomes on private land is planning. And that's both a, it's a confirmation. It's also a little bit hard when you've had such an extreme year of reform where some of those controls have been removed. However, as you said, Jane, there's new purposes in the scheme that speak to explicit requirements on climate change. So there's potential for further work on this area. We do need to change the narrative on planning and resilient design being a barrier. And from you, Narelle, what I got was that this is a real reality check that this is actually happening, and that local government have not only do we have obligations, ethical, moral, or whatever you might call them, but we also are the intersection with community. And because this is happening and our community is the solution, it really needs to be a collaborative response. And I did actually, one of the things that really stuck with me was this idea that at the very least, and I don't know, I don't work at a council, so I don't know if council's doing this, but at the very least, councils could be identifying land for relocation, you know, either proactively or as a first step in responding to an event. That's what struck me, Sally, in all of that.
Great, thanks, Natasha. Wonderful. Okay, so let's get into some of the other questions. And folks, if you want to raise your hand or keep putting questions in the chat, please do that. One of the kind of overarching questions that I had for probably anybody in the panel, and it's a fairly high level question, but what can councils do to protect their communities and themselves?
That is a pretty high level question. I mean, I think, you know, a really good example, you know, is what is it comes out of the example that Narelle gave. You know, the reality is, with climate change, we know, as I said, a lot of what needs to be done, and I think there's, you know, there's a pretty broad understanding of where the risks are, and so I think one of the really important things that councils can do is actually recognise the importance of building that in, and you know, going through their kind of their plans and their kind of controls, etc., and actually having a look at where they might have gaps. And sometimes that's going to mean that they need to kind of think a bit proactively and think about how they can kind of work around the system. Maybe that's, I think someone put in a question around whether any councils are identifying the land preemptively. You know, certainly in a Victorian context, local governments have often kind of led the way, if you like, and the state's kind of caught up further along. So certainly, I think there's definitely a role for councils in continuing to kind of push the envelope and push. There's a lot of council groups that are doing some really important work, and so I think really continuing in that space is a key thing that councils can do.
Thanks, Jane. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I think from my perspective, and there's the sort of legal and governance perspective, a sort of strong control is updating sort of documents, and whether it's like asset plans, strategic plans, those sorts of things, to embed climate sort of governance where it can be throughout the council, and that can help sort of mitigate some of those issues where when there's a change in councillor or whatever, changing councillors, whatever, if there's sort of the integration into the governance, the documents that sort of starts to flow through, that can be a strong risk mitigant.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm going to come to Nick, who's got his hand up in just a moment. But before I do, I'm curious to know what you all think about sorry, I lost my place. Actually, let's go to Nick. I've lost my page. Nick, take yourself off mute and go ahead.
No worries. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. I'm a strategic planner here in Southeast Queensland, so listening to Narelle talk about Grantham is very apt. We've found in recent months, going through updates of some of our natural hazard mapping, in particular flood hazards, and incorporating climate change, that there's been significant community pushback to that. That the lived experience of community members doesn't match the risk mapping for future events, particularly when considering increased rainfall and stuff from climate change. How does the panel suggest that we sort of navigate that space of planning outcomes with trying to get the community to come along on this journey and understand risk mapping and the impacts of climate change?
Narelle, you're probably best placed having worked at the intersection, but Nick, that's very certainly one of those big picture challenges that I think we do face in the planning space is, is that disconnection between the kind of the as you say, the lived experience and the kind of historical experience, if you like, of community members and um, their I guess their immediate impacts of some of the changes that we might need to make versus kind of what we need to do. And I think, there is a real tension between what those legal obligations are that Charlotte was talking to, and how you have those conversations with the community. And I think one of the key things is making sure that we're communicating in ways that people understand. So not talking in kind of planning speak or legal speak, really, trying to communicate actually what things like land use planning do, and why we're trying not to put people at risk, and using examples so that the community members can kind of see, hopefully see why we do this kind of work. But Narelle, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes, I totally agree, Jane. It has to be in simple language for communities to understand. And, we feel that it's going to be a slow burn for communities to get on board. Water Technology, we've worked with a number of communities, particularly in Western Australia, for example, where a building has been approved quite close to the ocean, and within 5 years, the ocean's taken it away. But the community still isn't on board to have their eyes open that, oh, actually, things are really changing. And in both Grantham and Lismore, they're both areas that flooded regularly, but, people adapt. And, yep, I've got a high-set house, so, the water can come underneath. I'll throw out everything from downstairs and I'll be safe. But both of those floods that I was in the recovery of were catastrophic. And, with 19 lives lost in Grantham, it was just not something that they'd experienced before. And so they were in shock. Anyone who's been through something like that would speak to communities who are in a flood zone, for example, and say, look, you've really got to plan ahead. You don't want to go through what we went through. It's dreadful. So they're your best advocates, really, people who've actually experienced it. So that, the more airplay we can all get, and we're getting more airplay about spending money pre-disaster rather than the post-disaster, billions that are spent in recovery. There's been a lot of work done in that space, but we've got to have the political will.
Great point. Thank you, Narelle. I'm going to come to Victoria in just a moment, but I wanted to come back to the question about, and I know that Jane and Natasha are particularly interested in this one. What do you see as some of the conflicts between councils' different obligations in different areas, and any tips on how to resolve them?
Sorry, when you talk about different obligations in different areas, can you just...
So for example, when an obligation to consider climate risk, for example, you talked a little bit about the Victorian drive on housing, and how that could be conflicts between different directives from state government, or different legal obligations, community expectations.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's and I will completely confess to being biased. I am a strategic planner, so I am a little bit biased in the in the role that good strategic planning can play. But the reality is how strategic planning is all about balancing all of those different things. And I think one of the really critical things as we look about how we can adapt to climate change is how we can use that approach that goes, okay, right, well, we need the housing. Okay, great. How much housing do we need? where are the areas that are at risk? Let's make sure that we know where those areas at risk are. We know which areas are, at such a high level of risk that we don't want to actually intensify development in those areas. Which areas have kind of lower levels of risk that we can manage through, for instance, the right design controls and the like. And then which, of those areas that are kind of low risk or where we can manage the risk, that's where we look to kind of deliver that growth and that housing. I mean, that conversation around change with those communities, because where those areas are might differ to where they were previously. It's a really important part of the conversation, but it's critically important that we start having that conversation now. These are kind of transitions and changes that are going to take decades to enact. And as Narelle's experienced, we're seeing the impacts now. In Victoria, we had the 2022 floods as well, were quite significant. So we're seeing those impacts now, but the conversations and that transition, as housing stock turns over, etc., that's going to take decades to play out. So we really, I've been, banging on about this for a while. We really need to put our foot on the accelerator in terms of actually, having that clarity around where those areas are, so that we can start doing that kind of forward-thinking planning, so that we have an understanding of across the state where those highest risk communities are, where there might be cumulative impacts and cumulative risks that we need to manage, and so where we need to start prioritising the kinds of outcomes that Narelle's been involved in places like Grantham, where we kind of need to start that conversation about shifting some of our settlement patterns. And certainly, PIA, the Planning Institute's been advocating for a kind of national settlement strategy for a long time to kind of start having those conversations.
Thanks, Jane. Natasha, do you want to add anything before I move on to Victoria?
No, thanks, Sally.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. Victoria, fire away.
Thank you. I was going to complement the positions of Tash. How do we plan for these future communities? How do we save space or whatever to respond to a different future? And then Narelle's and then Jane's. It's really hard. How do we have these conversations that are hard? And I'm an engineer, I work with planning teams, I work with all kinds of climate risk governance teams to try and preempt where our community is going to go, and try to do the best we can within our remit and have these challenging conversations. But I think it's worthy of is it another CEA forum or something like that? Let's have these hard conversations. I don't know the answer. We're seeing the impacts now. I'm also in my own hood, should be right. But then I realized the role I play, I'm looking at climate risk governance, decision making, how we factor forward financial estimates into our capital works planning, how we look after our future communities, but also in my own hood. To be honest, I know this is recorded, which is not quite a good thing, but I'm she'll be right, we'll figure it out. But also, how do we have these really hard conversations that are around future plannings for a future planning for a future community and climate that we will know will happen, but contrasting this with someone like me who's at, even though the role I play, but she'll be right, we'll figure it out, we always have. But then I feel like this overwhelming responsibility for the job that I have and others' role to plan for this. And how do we actually, people don't like thinking about the future. It's really hard to forecast for what will my future look like in 50 years, and we have all these aspirations, but to bring it back to now and what things we need to put in place that might be hard, or disruptions to our way of life. So that's probably too hard for a Tuesday afternoon, but just saying that I find it a real challenge for my role, and I know what role and what I represent as Marybeck City Council, and my team does an extraordinary job in trying to influence the future of our community, but also the really hard conversations we need to have now as a group of experts, but also with state and federal governments around the future of our community. I don't know what the answer is. So That was probably not really useful, but it's a question I'm
Look,
pondering.
I do think there is a really important conversation around messaging and communication of some of these issues. But I think there is a balance between the kind of decisive leadership and the kind of long-term stuff that might not necessarily be of interest to to a current community versus some of the kind of immediate conversations with the community about kind of what's going to impact them over the next kind of 10 years. Because I think sometimes people do find it challenging to look kind of, the reality is, life's not easy for a lot of people. And so kind of asking them to look 10, 20 years in the future and kind of, think about that is challenging. And there's lots of people doing fantastic work out there around kind of climate communication and how we can do that. But I do think there does come to a point, and I do feel we are at the point where, there is the need for some of that kind of more decisive leadership, which needs to link back to those legal obligations and the kind of that scientific evidence base, so that we kind of can move forward. But it really can be communicated in a way that I think maybe is a bit different to how we've communicated some of those challenges previously.
Thank you.
Thanks,
I'll just say
Jane.
briefly, if I may,
Yeah.
community engagement too. It's essential, but it's had a bit of a bad rap in recent years as a tick box affair. So we need to reclaim that, and it needs to be real and true. And the approach gently, rather than hitting people over the head with it.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Narelle.
completely agree with that.
There are so many fantastic questions that we haven't got to yet. We haven't got a hope of covering them in the next 4 minutes, and we do need to do a few things to wrap up. So I'm going to say thank you to everybody for all those great questions. And look, I know that Natasha's been busily storing away questions and answers. So I'll share that with you later on. And if we have a chance to maybe answer some of those unanswered questions, we'll do our best. But as Victoria said, there's probably room for more discussions just like this. So look out for those in future. I did notice somebody asked in the chat about how do we get our leaders on board, and so I think Annie very helpfully reminded us that we do offer governing in the climate emergency training for senior local government leaders. So please do push your leaders that way if you've got leaders who perhaps are passionate but need more information or actually need to kind of understand the urgency. But a few other ways, before we thank our speakers, a few other ways that you can connect with us. The Basecamp, of course, I'll flick over to this slide just to show you that. If any of you are officers who are not on our Basecamp, what are you doing? Please send me an email. I'll put you on there. There's more than 600, nearly 700 people chatting on there just about every day. Or just head over to our website to the contact page, and you can subscribe to all of our different things, training, events, webinars, etc., etc. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn. We've got some upcoming events that I've mentioned. The training, we've got our next round starting at the end of July. So that's actually still open for registrations right now, and for about the next 3 or 4 weeks. So that's still there. The 10th anniversary of the first ever Climate Emergency Declaration is coming up in December. We are planning some special events around that, so stay tuned for that. We've got our regular climate cafes, next one coming up at the end of this month. That is a space where if all of this is just getting a little bit overwhelming, a little bit like what Victoria talked about, and you feel the need to just vent what it's like to be a local government person working in this area, that's a great space to do it. So you can go to our events page to sign up for that. And somebody mentioned in the chat about the Make Big Polluters Pay campaign. So our next webinar coming up actually in late July is with communities for climate compensation. And that is looking at the whole topic of, how could we potentially get access to a fund for councils and communities to do some of this not just disaster recovery work, but also preparation and resilience building. So if you want to know how your council can get involved with that, come along to that one, again from our events page. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to say a really big thank you to Charlotte, to Jane, to Narelle, and of course to my co-host Natasha. Fantastic panel. And I'm just going to go back to the panel for 1 second to see if there's any last burning questions or comments that any of you want to make in summing up that fantastic discussion.
I'd have a very quick comment, and I'll say, just remember who you're planning for. It's the community who'll be living on that block of land or that apartment.
Great point.
Yeah, so true. So true. But I think, I mean, my key message is that really, you know, and many of you already know this, that, you know, the planning system really is a really strong lever. We might have some challenges, you know, in terms of how it's framed, but the fundamental importance of that planning system and planning that's done well in making sure that you know those communities are safe into the future remains a really, you know, a really important part of what we all do and can do.
Great.
And
Thank you, Jane.
I would say that it is not something that you can do alone. So there's some quirks, as we've seen, coming through the chats, and good work that's just not been able to land, and that there's some really difficult decisions in all of this that need to be made. And sometimes that's really hard when you're living in that place. And so I think that, it's a combination of community, it's a combination of local government supporting community, but also calling on the state to act when it's needed.
Yes, very good
And
point.
I think
Thank you,
like
Natasha.
echoing that, really just for me, my kind of key takeaway was there's not one lever that's going to be the answer, whether it's like the legal duty of care or whatever. It's everything together, and that even where the councils might be on board, the community is such an important consideration. And I learned so much from all of you. Thank you. I was scribbling away in my notebook.
Fabulous. Well, hopefully you all did. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I'll ask my panel of speakers to just stay on for a couple of minutes if you would, and say thank you to everybody else, and we'll see you next time.